The morning of my 73rd birthday, I woke up to the smell of bacon coming from the kitchen downstairs. For just a moment, before my eyes fully opened, I thought it was my wife, Carol. 14 years she had been gone, and there were still mornings where that half-second of warmth hit me before reality caught up. I lay there on my side of the bed. I never once crossed to her side, not in all those years, and I listened to the sounds rising from the floor below. Pots, the refrigerator door, my son's voice, low and purposeful, my daughter-in-law's heels on the tile. I should have recognized that sound for what it was. Not love, not celebration, preparation. I had lived in that house for 31 years. Carol and I had bought it the spring after my son Raymond was born, when the neighborhood was still mostly young families, and the oak tree in the backyard was no taller than I was. We painted every room ourselves. She chose the yellow for the kitchen. I built the bookshelves in the study by hand, level by level, weekend by weekend, while Raymond sat in a laundry basket behind me on the floor and chewed on his shoelaces. When our daughter Patricia came along 4 years later, we converted the small sunroom off the back of the house into her bedroom because she said she wanted to wake up and see the garden first thing every morning. She was 6 years old when she said that. I thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard a child say. I gave everything I had to those 2 kids. Everything a man can give. I drove them to every practice, every recital, every tournament that required a 4-hour drive on a Saturday. When Raymond's first business failed, a gym equipment supply company, he started in his early 30s. I gave him $60,000 from the retirement savings Carol and I had built together without a single word about repayment. When Patricia's marriage ended badly and she needed somewhere to land, I told her she could stay in this house for as long as she needed. She stayed for 2 years. I never once made her feel like a burden. I retired at 68 from the civil engineering firm I had worked at for 34 years. I had a pension. I had my savings. I had the house, which by then was worth considerably more than what Carol and I had paid for it. I was comfortable, not wealthy, but comfortable in the way a man can be when he has spent his whole working life being careful with what he earns. What I am telling you is this. I was not a helpless old man. I was not confused. I was not unable to care for myself. I drove my own car. I cooked my own meals, most of them well. I went to the gym 3 mornings a week with my friend Gerald, who I had known since we coached Little League together when our sons were 8 years old. I had a doctor I liked, and I went to every appointment, and I took my blood pressure medication exactly as prescribed because I am not a fool. But that birthday morning, sitting at my own kitchen table while Raymond served me bacon and eggs, and Patricia sat across from me with her hands folded and her face arranged into something that was supposed to resemble concern, I started to understand that I had made a mistake somewhere. The mistake wasn't financial. The mistake wasn't the house or the savings or any decision I had ever made about money. The mistake was that I had believed, without ever really examining the belief, that the children I had raised to be decent human beings were, in fact, decent human beings. Raymond opened the conversation the way a man opens a door he has already picked the lock on, carefully, slowly, as if the action itself is casual when everything about it is calculated. "Dad," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "Patricia and I have been talking." I looked at my eggs. "Have you?" "We're worried about you," Patricia said. Her voice had that particular softness that I had come to recognize over the years as the voice she used when she wanted something, not the voice she used when she was genuinely sad, which dropped lower and rougher. This was her persuasion voice. "We just want to make sure you're okay." I told them I was fine. I told them I had been fine for the entire 5 years since I retired, and I expected to continue being fine for a good while yet. That was the beginning of it. Over the following weeks, the concern arrived in waves. My son came by on a Tuesday afternoon to find me on a step stool in the garage reaching for a paint can on a high shelf. You would have thought he had walked in on a hostage situation. He grabbed the ladder from under me with such urgency that I nearly did fall, which would have been ironic in a way that wouldn't have been funny at all. He made me sit down. He made me a cup of tea I didn't ask for. He sat across from me in my own living room with his forearms on his knees and his eyes doing that thing where they look worried but the jaw is tight with something else. "Dad, you could have broken your hip." "Raymond," I said, "I have been reaching things on high shelves for 50 years. That's the point. You're not as he stopped. He had the good sense not to finish that sentence, but I heard it anyway. You're not as young. You're not as steady. You're not as capable as you think you are." Patricia started calling every morning. "Just to check in," she said, "to say good morning." I told her I appreciated it, and I did, at first, but the calls had a shape to them that I began to notice. They always included at least one question about how I had slept, whether I had eaten, whether I had taken my medication. Each one delivered in a tone so careful and so practiced that it started to feel less like a phone call from my daughter and more like an intake assessment at a clinic. The medication question was the one that finally made something cold settle in my chest. "You haven't forgotten your blood pressure pills, right, Dad?" Patricia asked one morning in October. "No," I said. "I have not forgotten my blood pressure pills, because last month you mentioned you couldn't find them." I thought back. In September, I had spent about 10 minutes looking for my pill organizer, which I had left in the bathroom at Gerald's house after we worked on his deck together for a weekend. I had laughed about it on the phone with Patricia. A 10-minute inconvenience, laughed off in 30 seconds. And here it was being cited back to me 6 weeks later as evidence of something. "I left them at Gerald's house," I said. "I found them the same afternoon." "I know," she said. "I just worry. I let it go. I should not have let it go." In November, Raymond called to ask if I had thought any more about what they had discussed. I asked him which conversation he meant, because by then there had been many. He meant the conversation we had at Thanksgiving, at my own dining room table, with a turkey I had cooked and a table I had set, in a house I had paid for with 31 years of my own labor. Raymond and Patricia had spent the better part of that afternoon explaining to me, in patient and revolving detail, that a man my age living alone in a 4-bedroom house wasn't really practical, that there were wonderful communities designed for people in exactly my situation, that I would have friends, activities, people around, that they would come visit every week. Of course they would. I had sat at the head of that table and listened and said very little. Later I understood that my silence was interpreted as agreement, or at least as a door left open. What I had not said, sitting at that table, was that I knew about Raymond's money problems. He had never told me, but Gerald's son worked at the same bank where Raymond had taken out a second mortgage on his house 2 years before, and news like that travels in a small town the way water travels, finding its way through every crack. I knew that Raymond's second business, a logistics consulting firm he had started after the gym equipment failure, was struggling. I knew that his wife, Diane, had a spending habit that Raymond had never quite found the courage to address. And I knew, because I am not stupid, and because I had seen the way Raymond's eyes moved around my living room when he thought I wasn't watching, that he had done the math on this house. I want to be fair to my daughter. I think Patricia was genuinely frightened of watching her father age. She had been close to her mother, closer than Raymond, and Carol's death had been hard and fast, a stroke, 7 weeks, from diagnosis to the end, and I think Patricia had never fully resolved whatever terror that planted in her. I think she looked at me in my house alone and felt something real. I do not think she was purely mercenary the way Raymond was. But I also think she allowed herself to be convinced of things she wanted to be convinced of because it was easier than disagreeing with her brother. And that is a kind of failure too, even when it comes from a softer place. December arrived and with it the paperwork. Raymond brought it to me on a Sunday afternoon, a folder of documents he set on the kitchen table with the manner of a man presenting something reasonable. He explained that it was a power of attorney, a standard arrangement, Nothing unusual, just a practical measure for a man my age living alone so that, if anything ever happened, someone would be able to manage my affairs without the courts getting involved. He explained this the way you explain something to someone who might not understand the words you're using. I asked him to leave it with me and let me read it. He said, of course, no rush. Take all the time I needed. I read it that evening. Then I read it again. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Frances who had handled my estate documents since before Carol died, and I read the relevant sections to her over the phone. Frances listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Leonard," she said, "that document gives Raymond full authority over your financial accounts, your property, and your medical decisions. It's not a limited POA, it's a comprehensive one. I already knew that. I needed to hear it said out loud by someone else to confirm I wasn't reading it wrong." "What would you like to do?" Frances asked. I told her I would be in touch. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark in my house, and I thought about the oak tree in the backyard, which was now taller than the house, and which Raymond had suggested 3 times over the past year that I should have cut down before it caused any damage. I thought about Carol's yellow kitchen, which I had never repainted because I liked seeing it that color. I thought about Patricia's sunroom bedroom, which was now my study, and about the shelves I had built in there board by board. I thought about 31 years of a life built in one place, in one house, by 2 people who loved each other and tried to do right by their children. In January, without signing anything, I visited Frances in her office. We spent 2 hours going over documents I had not touched in years. Among other things, I asked her to help me complete a transaction I had been sitting on for quite some time, a simple addition to my existing holdings. Or rather, a formal documentation of something that had existed for 20 years and simply had never been made as explicit as it needed to be. I will come back to that. In February, Raymond stopped asking and started insisting. The conversations lost their careful softness. He told me directly that Patricia and he had found a community in Maplewood, 40 minutes from town, that had an opening, that was highly rated, that would give me everything I needed. He used the word safety 11 times in one conversation. I counted. I told him I would think about it. What I was actually doing was organizing. Quietly and without anyone's knowledge, I was reorganizing. The morning Raymond drove me to Maplewood to see the facility, I let him lead me through it the way you let a child lead you through something they're proud of. It was a clean place, nicer than many I had seen described. The staff were kind. The rooms had large windows. I said all of this to Raymond because it was true. He seemed relieved and talked all the way home about how this was the right decision and how much better he would sleep knowing I was safe. I looked out the window of his car at the town I had lived in for 31 years and said nothing. The move happened in March. I want you to understand something. I did not fight it. I had my reasons for not fighting it, and they were not the reasons Raymond and Patricia believed they were. They believed I had finally come around. They believed the gentle campaign of concern and paperwork had softened me into compliance. Patricia cried when the movers came for my furniture, genuine tears, which I found difficult to watch. Raymond shook the hand of the facility director with the authority of a man who had accomplished something. I moved into Maplewood on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had met Gerald for coffee at the cafe down the road because there is a road, and I can walk to the end of it and get into a cab, because I am not a prisoner, whatever Raymond's tone seemed to suggest. Gerald and I sat for 2 hours. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I was better than I had been in months, which confused him. What I had not told Raymond or Patricia, what they had not thought to investigate, what they had assumed without checking because it was convenient to assume, was that I had not sold the house. Raymond had found a buyer in January. He had been very organized about it. He had spoken to a realtor. He had described the property in terms of square footage and lot size and comparable recent sales in the neighborhood. He had brought the paperwork to my kitchen table the same way he had brought the power of attorney in a folder with a pen. He had not checked whether the power of attorney had actually been signed and notarized. It had not been. I had thanked him for his research. I had taken the folder. I had let him believe what he wanted to believe. And 2 weeks later, while he thought I was taking my time considering, Francis had filed documents that transferred the house into a living trust that neither of my children could touch without my explicit, in-person authorization. The house did not sell. The house could not sell. Raymond discovered this in April, 6 weeks after my move to Maplewood, when the title search came back, and the buyer's attorney called him with questions he could not answer. He called me that evening, voice tight in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager, and I had caught him in a lie. "Dad," he said, "there seems to be some kind of problem with the house title." "What kind of problem?" I asked. He explained. I listened. When he finished, I said, "Raymond, the house is in my trust. I set that up in January." The silence on the other end of the call was very long. "I don't understand," he said. "I know," I said. "But the house was only part of it." What I had never told my children, not because I was hiding it, exactly, but because it had never come up in the way these things sometimes don't come up, was that in 1999, Carol and I had purchased a small commercial property on Aldrich Street in the old part of downtown. We had done it on the advice of a friend of mine who was a real estate attorney, a quiet investment meant to generate rental income during retirement. Carol had handled most of the paperwork and the management of it because she had more patience for that sort of thing than I did. When she died, I had carried on with it. The property had 4 retail units on the ground floor and 6 residential apartments above. Raymond's logistics consulting office was on the ground floor. He had been renting from me for 3 years without knowing I was his landlord. The holding company Carol had set up was named Linden Grove Properties, LLC, which meant nothing to Raymond. His lease was managed through a property management firm. He sent his check every month to an address in the next county. He had never asked, and I had never offered, and for 3 years this had simply been the unremarkable way things were. I called my property manager the day after Raymond's phone call about the title search. I gave him instructions. The letter arrived at Raymond's office on a Thursday. Formal notice, as required by the lease, that Linden Grove Properties, LLC had elected not to renew at the end of the current term, 90 days hence. Business reasons. No personal animosity. Simply a decision by the property owner. Raymond called me 11 times before I answered. When I did answer, I kept my voice level. I told him what I am telling you now, that I had owned that building for 24 years, that I had watched his business grow in a space that, had he known, might have given him some comfort during the hard years, knowing his father was his landlord and not a stranger, that I had never used it as leverage, that I had never intended to use it as leverage, but that I was 73 years old and I was not confused and I was not incapable, and what had been done to me over the past 6 months, the paperwork, the pressure, the management of my mind and my choices, as if I were a child who needed to be guided rather than a man who had the right to make his own decisions, had consequences. He said, "Dad, we were trying to help you." I said, "I know you believe that." I said, "I need you to understand something, Raymond. Help looks like a question, not a folder of documents on a kitchen table. Help sounds like, 'What do you need, Dad?' Not, 'Here's what we've decided is best for you. I raised you. I know the difference between concern and convenience. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you know it too." There was a long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. I did not enjoy it. I want you to know that. There is nothing satisfying about watching your son's certainty collapse. He is still my son. Whatever he did, he was still the baby in the laundry basket chewing on shoelaces on a Saturday morning while his father built bookshelves one board at a time. Patricia called the next day. She cried, which was different from her persuasion voice, lower and rougher the way I told you. She said she was sorry. She said she had told herself she was doing the right thing and that she had let herself believe it because it was easier than asking harder questions. She said she missed her mother and that watching me alone in that house frightened her in a way she hadn't known how to say out loud. I told her I missed her mother too. I told her that fear was not the same thing as being right. I told her that what I needed from her was not management. What I needed was a daughter who called me because she wanted to hear my voice, not to verify that I had taken my medication. What I needed was Sunday dinners and someone to argue with about the football game and someone to drive to the airport with when she visited because I like driving, and the drive to the airport takes 40 minutes and 40 minutes in a car. With my daughter is something I consider a privilege, not a chore to be eliminated for efficiency. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I didn't know you felt that way about the airport." I said, "There are a lot of things you would know if you had been asking instead of assuming." I stayed at Maplewood for 4 more months, not because I was required to, not because anyone was making me. I stayed because I had decided to try it, and I am a man who finishes what he starts. I made 2 good friends there, a retired judge named Harold and a woman named Estelle who had spent 40 years as a high school chemistry teacher and who beat me at chess 6 times before I finally won a game. The staff were kind. The food was decent 3 days out of 5. I will not pretend I didn't sometimes sit at the window and look at the parking lot and feel something I can only describe as the specific loneliness of being in a place where you are well cared for by people who do not love you. In August, I went home. Frances helped me with everything. The house came out of the trust. I had the place painted in the fall, kept Carol's yellow in the kitchen, and I had the bookshelves in the study restained because they had started to look tired. Gerald came over and helped me with them on a Saturday. We put on the game and worked without talking much, the way you can with someone who has known you long enough that silence is comfortable. Raymond found a new office space on the other side of town. We did not speak for 2 months. When we finally did speak, it was at Patricia's birthday dinner in September, seated at a restaurant table with her kids between us, and the conversation was careful and somewhat formal, but it was a beginning. I believe in beginnings. A man who stopped believing in beginnings would have given up a long time ago, and I have never been a man who gives up. What I want to tell you, and what I think about sometimes in the evenings when the house is quiet, and I'm sitting in the study with one of Carol's old books, and the light coming through the window turning orange the way it does in October, is this. Getting older is not the same as getting less. A man of 73 has things a young man does not have. He has the ability to recognize a pattern when it repeats itself. He has the patience to wait and the wisdom to know that rushing is almost never the answer. He has, if he has lived with any attention at all, a deep and settled knowledge of who he is and what he values, and that knowledge is not something that gets taken from you unless you hand it over yourself. I did not hand it over. Some people who hear stories like this want the ending to be dramatic. They want the son brought low in some final and public way, the daughter weeping in a courthouse, the old man triumphant with his arms raised. I understand the appeal of that. I felt it myself at 2 a.m. in February, lying in the dark listening to the oak tree move in the wind outside my window. But that is not the ending I wanted. The ending I wanted was to drive my own car to Gerald's house on a Tuesday morning and carry in a box of pastries from the bakery on 5th and sit at his kitchen table and talk about nothing in particular for 2 hours. The ending I wanted was to have my daughter call me on a Sunday, not to check on my medication, but to ask if I had watched the game last night and what I thought about the fourth quarter. The ending I wanted was to sit in my own study, in my own chair, surrounded by the bookshelves I built with my own hands 30 years ago, and know that I was exactly where I had decided to be. That is the ending I have. I am 73 years old. I take my blood pressure medication every morning without being reminded. I drive to the gym 3 times a week. I beat Estelle at chess once a month when she comes over for dinner, and she beats me twice, and we both pretend it's an even contest. Raymond and I are not what we were, but we are something, and something is a place to start. Patricia and I have our Sunday calls back, and they are different now, quieter, more careful, more real. The oak tree in the backyard is taller than the house. I have decided to keep it. Carol would have liked that.